in the frozen silence of the Russian winter. Beneath endless forests, golden domes, and blood-soaked battlefields lies the story of a nation unlike any other, a land where emperors once ruled with divine authority, where revolutions shattered centuries-old thrones, where an iron curtain fell across Europe, dividing the world in two. This is the tale of ambition and tragedy, of faith and fire, of love for the motherland and fear of its power. From the opulent halls of the Tsars to the rise of the Soviet Union, from the terror of the Cold War to the ambitions of modern Russia, this is not just history. This is destiny written in ice and blood. Welcome to the saga of Russia. History. The birth of a giant, land of endless horizons. Russia is not merely a country, it is a world unto itself, stretching across 11 time zones and spanning 2 continents. This colossal landmass holds within it the whispers of ancient civilizations, nomadic tribes, and forgotten empires. Long before Moscow's golden domes pierced the sky, the endless steppes echoed with the thunder of horses belonging to the Scythians, Sarmatians, and Slavic tribes. This land has always been one of extremes, of unbearable cold and fertile plains, of isolation and unrelenting conquest. Geography shaped Russia's destiny. Its vast size offered protection, yet invited invasion. Its frozen rivers and deep forests hid secrets, but left people vulnerable to hunger and war. From the icy shores of the Arctic to the Caspian deserts, Russia was destined to forge a unique identity, a civilization at the crossroads between Europe and Asia. Drawing strength and suffering from both worlds, the rise of Kievan Rus. In the 9th century, the foundations of Russian civilization were laid with the birth of Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic tribes under the rule of the Varangians, Norse warriors who sailed down the Dnieper River, led by princes like Oleg and, later, Vladimir the Great. Kievan Rus became a hub of trade, connecting the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire. It was here, in 988 AD, that Vladimir embraced Eastern Orthodox Christianity, binding Russia's spiritual identity to Byzantium and shaping its cultural soul for centuries. But this early golden age was fragile. The land was divided among competing principalities, and the power of Kievan Rus began to fracture. As the Mongol Empire rose in the east, a storm unlike any other approached the Russian heartland. Under the Mongol yoke. In 1237, the unthinkable happened. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, led his armies into the lands of Rus. Cities burned, thousands perished, and the once mighty Kievan Rus was shattered under the brutal dominance of the Golden Horde. For more than 2 centuries, Russian princes paid tribute to their Mongol overlords, surviving through submission while nurturing quiet resistance. Yet paradoxically, under Mongol rule, Russia learned valuable lessons: centralized authority, taxation systems, and military organization tools that would one day fuel its rise. It was during this dark period that the small but ambitious Principality of Moscow began to rise, slowly gathering power, forging alliances, and preparing for a destiny greater than anyone could imagine: the birth of Moscow's power. By the 14th century, Moscow emerged as the new center of Russian identity. Its princes, especially Ivan I Khalida, skillfully balanced diplomacy and force, collecting taxes for the Mongols while quietly consolidating power. Moscow became the spiritual heart of Russia when the Russian Orthodox Church moved its seat there, granting it divine legitimacy. In 1380, at the Battle of Kulikovo, Prince Dmitry Donskoy led a coalition of Russian forces to a symbolic victory against the Mongols, a spark of hope that one day Russia would be free. Over the next century, Moscow's power grew relentlessly, absorbing rival principalities and positioning itself as the leader of a reborn Russian state. Ivan the Terrible and the birth of empire. Then came Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, In 1547, he became the first ruler crowned as Tsar of all Russia, signaling the birth of an empire. Ivan expanded Russian territory at a staggering pace, pushing into the Volga, the Urals, and Siberia. But his reign was drenched in blood, marked by paranoia, brutal purges, and the infamous Oprynina, a reign of terror that left entire cities devastated. Ivan's Russia became both feared and admired, a vast empire rising from the ashes of Mongol domination, yet haunted by instability and cruelty. When Ivan died in 1584, Russia stood on the edge of greatness and chaos, the time of troubles. After the death of Ivan the Terrible in 1584, Russia descended into one of its darkest chapters, the time of troubles. With no clear heir to the throne, rival factions, foreign invaders, and famine tore the nation apart. Polish and Swedish armies occupied Russian lands, while peasants starved amid failed harvests. Entire villages disappeared. It seemed as though the fragile Russian state might vanish forever. But from this chaos emerged a new dynasty. The Romanovs. In 1613, a young nobleman, Mikhail Romanov, was crowned Tsar, beginning a family line that would rule Russia for more than 300 years. Under the Romanovs, Russia would transform from a fragmented medieval realm into one of the world's most powerful empires. But this transformation would come at an unimaginable cost. Peter the Great, the visionary Tsar. In the late 17th century, a towering figure rose to reshape Russia's destiny, Peter I, known as Peter the Great. Standing over 2 meters tall, Peter was larger than life in every sense. He envisioned dragging Russia out of its medieval past and turning it into a modern European power. Obsessed with the West, he traveled incognito to European capitals, learning shipbuilding, engineering, and military science. Returning home, he unleashed a wave of reforms, reorganizing the army, modernizing industry, and even changing how Russians dressed and spoke. In 1703, he founded a city on the swampy banks of the Neva River, St. Petersburg, which he called his window to Europe. But Peter's vision came with an iron fist. Those who resisted faced brutal punishment. Through his relentless will, Russia became a naval power, defeating Sweden in the Great Northern War and securing access to the Baltic Sea. The world could no longer ignore Russia. Peter had forced it onto the global stage. Catherine the Great and the Golden Age. If Peter built the foundations of empire, Catherine the Great turned it into a masterpiece. Born a German princess, she seized power in 1762 after a coup against her husband, Tsar Peter III. Brilliant, charismatic, and ruthless when needed, Catherine expanded Russian territory deeper into Ukraine, the Crimea, and the Black Sea coast, defeating the Ottoman Empire and bringing vast new lands under Russian control. But Catherine wasn't just a conqueror. She was also a patron of the arts, literature, and philosophy. Inspired by the European Enlightenment, she corresponded with thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, ushering in what many call Russia's golden age. Yet, beneath this glittering surface, unrest simmered. Serfdom, the system that bound millions of peasants to the land, deepened social inequality. While palaces shone with chandeliers and European art, the countryside remained locked in medieval poverty. Russia was growing stronger, but also more divided. The fire of invasions. In 1812, Russia faced its greatest test yet, the invasion of Napoleon Bonaparte. Leading one of the largest armies in history, Napoleon marched deep into Russia, expecting a swift victory. But Russia's greatest weapon was not its armies, it was its land. As Napoleon advanced, Russian forces under General Kutuzov burned their own villages, crops, and resources in a strategy of scorched earth. By the time Napoleon reached a deserted Moscow, winter had begun to fall. Starving, freezing, and harassed by Russian raids, the Grande Armée disintegrated during its retreat. Of the 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. The defeat of Napoleon elevated Russia to the rank of a European superpower. Yet the victory came at a price. Millions lay dead, cities were in ruins, and the seeds of future unrest had been sown. The seeds of revolution. By the mid-19th century, the Russian Empire had reached its territorial zenith, stretching from Poland to the Pacific Ocean. But this vastness masked deep structural weaknesses. Millions of peasants lived in bondage under serfdom, while a small aristocracy enjoyed unimaginable wealth. The defeat in the Crimean War, 1853-1856, exposed Russia's technological backwardness compared to the industrialized West. Reformers like Tsar Alexander II tried to modernize the empire, famously emancipating the serfs in 1861. But freedom came without land or opportunity, leaving many trapped in poverty. Political radicals, frustrated by half measures, turned to revolution and assassination. In 1881, Alexander II himself was killed by a bomb, plunging Russia into a spiral of repression and rebellion. The empire was marching steadily toward an inevitable confrontation, one that would tear it apart and give birth to a new, more radical Russia, the twilight of the Tsars. By the early 20th century, the mighty Russian Empire stood on fragile foundations. Its vast size concealed deep cracks, social unrest, economic inequality, and political stagnation. The rule of Tsar Nicholas II was marked by indecision and detachment, even as the world entered a new industrial age. In 1905, defeat at the hands of Japan shocked the empire and ignited a wave of protests, strikes, and violent uprisings. Nicholas attempted reforms but granted only limited freedoms, angering both liberals and radicals. The situation worsened. With the outbreak of World War I in 1914, millions of poorly equipped Russian soldiers were sent to the front lines, where they faced devastating losses against German forces. At home, food shortages, inflation, and famine pushed the nation to the edge. Russia was bleeding, starving, and furious. A storm was about to break: the 1917 Russian Revolution. In February 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd, modern-day St. Petersburg. Workers demanded bread, soldiers mutinied, and the empire spiraled into chaos. By March, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending over 300 years of Romanov rule. A provisional government was formed, promising democracy, but it failed to deliver peace, land, and food, the very things the people demanded. In the shadows, a radical faction prepared to seize power: the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin. In October 1917, Lenin's forces stormed the Winter Palace, toppling the provisional government and declaring a workers' state. The Russian Empire was dead. In its place, a new ideology was born: communism. But the revolution unleashed chaos. From 1917 to 1922, Russia was consumed by a brutal civil war between the Red Army Bolsheviks and the White Army Royalists and moderates. When the smoke cleared, Lenin's Bolsheviks had triumphed. And in 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was officially born: Stalin's iron fist. After Lenin's death in 1924, a power struggle erupted within the Communist Party. Out of this turmoil rose Joseph Stalin, a man whose name would become synonymous with terror. Stalin transformed the Soviet Union into a centralized industrial powerhouse, but at a horrifying cost. Through his 5-year plans, he forced rapid industrialization, building factories, railways, and military complexes at an unprecedented pace. Yet millions of peasants were stripped of their land under collectivization, leading to widespread famine, most tragically in Ukraine's Holodomor 1932-1933, where millions starved to death. Stalin's paranoia knew no limits. During the Great Purge, 1936 to 1938, Hundreds of thousands were executed or sent to gulags, labor camps in the frozen wilderness. Under Stalin, the USSR became a superpower in the making. But it was a nation built on fear, silence, and unimaginable suffering. World War II, the Great Patriotic War. In 1941, Stalin faced his greatest test when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. The Nazi war machine swept deep into Soviet territory, capturing entire cities and slaughtering civilians. But Russia's resilience became legendary. At the Siege of Leningrad, the city endured 900 days days, yet refused to surrender. At Stalingrad 194–21943, Soviet forces fought street by street, house by house, until they turned the tide of the war. The victory came at an unfathomable price. 27 million Soviet citizens died in what Russians still call the Great Patriotic War. By 1945, Soviet troops stormed Berlin, hoisting the red flag over the Reichstag. The USSR emerged from the ashes as a global superpower, but one locked in a new confrontation that would define the 20th century, the birth of the Cold War. In the aftermath of World War II, the alliance between the Soviet Union and the West collapsed almost instantly. As Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence, Winston Churchill famously declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. The world split into two rival camps, the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, dominated by the USSR. An ideological conflict began. The Cold War fought not through direct battles, but through proxy wars, espionage, and nuclear brinkmanship. From the Berlin blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world stood repeatedly on the edge of annihilation, while the United States boomed economically. The Soviet Union poured its resources into military buildup and space exploration, achieving milestones like launching Sputnik in 1957 and sending Yuri Gagarin into space in 1961. For decades, humanity lived under the shadow of mutually assured destruction. The USSR was at the height of its power. Yet cracks were already forming beneath the surface. Culture, the soul of Mother Russia, a language forged by history. Russian is more than a language. It is a mirror of survival, a vessel that carries centuries of triumphs, tragedies, and transformations. Emerging from Old East Slavic, the Russian tongue absorbed influences from Greek, Turkic, French, and German, reflecting the tides of invasions and alliances that shaped the land. Its 33-letter Cyrillic alphabet, developed by Byzantine missionaries in the 9th century, gave Russia a unique voice that tied it to the Eastern Orthodox tradition. The language itself is rich with nuance, poetry, and emotion. A single Russian word can hold layers of meaning. Toska, for example, conveys a deep, aching longing that English cannot capture. Through Russian, one feels the weight of vast landscapes, the silence of frozen steppes, and the echoes of ancestral songs. It is the thread that connects peasants and poets, revolutionaries and rulers, the heartbeat of a nation too immense to be defined by borders alone. Literature, voices of the Russian soul. If Russian culture has a crown jewel, it is its literature, a window into the nation's deepest fears, dreams, and moral struggles. In the 19th century, Russia produced an unparalleled wave of literary giants who reshaped world literature. Alexander Pushkin, the father of Russian poetry, blended folklore and modernity, giving Russia its poetic identity. Fyodor Dostoevsky explored the darkest corners of the human psyche in masterpieces like Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov, confronting themes of guilt, redemption, and faith. Leo Tolstoy captured the vast sweep of Russian society. In War and Peace and Anna Karenina, blending personal passion with historical destiny. Later, Anton Chekhov revolutionized drama with plays like The Cherry Orchard, exposing the quiet tragedies of everyday life. Russian literature is not merely art, it is confession, philosophy, and prophecy all at once. It invites readers to wrestle with eternal questions. What is freedom? What is morality? And what does it mean to be human in a world of suffering? And beauty, music, and ballet, elegance in motion. Russia's cultural voice does not stop at words. It soars in music and ballet, where emotions transcend language. Composers like Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky gave the world immortal works such as Swan Lake, The Nutcracker, and 1812 Overture, melodies that still stir hearts across continents. Sergei Rachmaninoff poured his soul into sweeping piano concertos, while Igor Stravinsky revolutionized modern music with The Rite of Spring, shocking audiences and redefining artistic boundaries. Alongside music, Russia elevated ballet to divine heights. The Bolshoi Theater in Moscow and the Mariinsky Theater in St. Petersburg became temples of movement and grace. Legendary dancers like Anna Pavlova and Mikhail Baryshnikov transformed ballet into a universal language of beauty and longing. In every pirouette and every crescendo, one feels Russia's essence, a fusion of melancholy and passion, discipline and fire, architecture, stones that speak. Russia's story is etched into its architecture, where golden onion domes, vast palaces, and brutalist Soviet monuments stand as silent witnesses to history. Nowhere is this more striking than in Moscow's Red Square, where St. Basil's Cathedral bursts with vibrant colors and swirling patterns, a symbol of medieval imagination and spiritual devotion. In St. Petersburg, Peter the Great's dream city, Baroque masterpieces like the Winter Palace and neoclassical wonders like the Kazan Cathedral reflect Russia's yearning to belong to Europe while maintaining its unique identity. Yet the Soviet era brought a stark transformation. Constructivist architecture replaced ornament with ideology, and colossal monuments like Motherland Calls in Volgograd became symbols of collective strength and sacrifice. Today, Russia's skylines blend imperial grandeur with Soviet pragmatism and modern glass towers, a living testament to its layered, complex soul, the unbreakable Russian spirit. Through centuries of upheaval, invasions, revolutions, wars, and famine, one thing has endured: the Russian spirit. It is a spirit forged in hardship, yet tempered by art, faith, and resilience. Russians often speak of Rodina, the motherland, with reverence, as though the land itself is alive, breathing through forests, rivers, and endless plains. This connection to nature is woven into folklore and song, where bears dance. In stories and birch trees whisper ancient secrets. Festivals like Maslenitsa celebrate the arrival of spring with bonfires and feasts, while solemn commemorations like Victory Day honor the sacrifices of ancestors. The Russian people have endured suffering that would have broken many nations, yet they rise, again and again, carrying their history like a shield and their dreams like a torch. To understand Russia's culture is to understand its resilience, a soul forever searching for meaning between tragedy and triumph, faith and the Russian Orthodox Church. For over 1,000 years, faith has been at the center of Russia's identity. When Vladimir the Great converted to Eastern Orthodox Christianity in 988 AD, he did more than choose a religion. He forged a spiritual bond that shaped Russia's destiny. The Russian Orthodox Church became a cornerstone of cultural life, filling cities with golden-domed cathedrals, solemn chants, and vibrant iconography. Inside the sacred halls of the Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius or the Kazan Cathedral, believers whisper prayers beneath frescoed ceilings that seem to reach heaven itself. Even during the Soviet era, when atheism was state policy and churches were demolished or repurposed, faith survived underground, passed down quietly through families and whispered prayers. Today, Orthodoxy has resurged with renewed strength, symbolizing the eternal link between spiritual devotion and national identity. To walk through Russia's ancient monasteries is to step into the soul of a nation that has carried its faith across centuries of upheaval and oppression. Cinema, painting, and the visual arts. Russian culture speaks powerfully through images, both still and moving. In the early 20th century, directors like Sergei Eisenstein revolutionized cinema with groundbreaking works like Battleship Potemkin, 1925, whose Odessa Steppe sequence is still studied as a masterpiece of visual storytelling. Soviet cinema became a tool of ideology, but also a canvas for genius, producing legends like Andrei Tarkovsky, whose films such as Andrei Rublev and Stalker explore faith, mortality, and the human condition with haunting poetry. Painting, too, flourished. Andrei Rublev's icons became spiritual treasures, while artists like Ilya Repin captured the soul of Russian life in powerful realism. In the avant-garde movement, visionaries like Kazimir Malevich and Vasily Kandinsky pushed boundaries, influencing global art. Today, Russian cinema and painting remain deeply rooted in emotional storytelling, blending historical memory with existential reflection, revealing a people forever wrestling with destiny. Russian cuisine, a taste of the land. Russia's cuisine tells a story of survival and abundance, hardship and celebration. In a land of long winters and vast plains, food has always been a reflection of geography and history. The humble borscht, a beetroot soup served hot or cold, speaks of Slavic tradition and resourcefulness. Pelmeni, delicate dumplings filled with meat, trace their origins to Siberia, where travelers needed food that could withstand freezing temperatures. During religious fasting, dishes like blini thin pancakes, often topped with caviar or honey, became festive symbols of renewal, especially during Maslenitsa, Russia's carnival of spring. Under the Soviets, cuisine adapted to scarcity. Communal kitchens, ration cards, and shared recipes created a sense of unity amid deprivation. Yet, even in struggle, Russians infused meals with meaning, every dish tied to memory, celebration, or faith. Today, Russian cuisine is a blend of ancient traditions and modern influences, inviting the world to taste its complex heritage, folklore, myths, and superstitions. Before the arrival of Christianity, Russia's forests, rivers, and mountains were alive with pagan gods, spirits, and myths, and these echoes remain to this day. In Russian folklore, creatures like the Baba Yaga, a fearsome witch who lives in a hut on chicken legs, test the courage of heroes and heroines. Tales of Koschy, the Deathless, a villain whose soul is hidden away from his body, symbolize the eternal struggle between life and mortality. Even today, many Russians carry quiet superstitions rooted in ancient beliefs. Never whistle indoors, or you'll lose your wealth. Always sit for a moment before a long journey to invite safe passage. Never shake hands across a threshold, as it invites misfortune. These traditions reflect a cultural memory where nature and spirituality intertwine, where forests hold secrets and rivers whisper warnings. Through folklore, Russians keep alive a world where the past still breathes beneath the surface of modern life. The Soviet impact on cultural identity. The Soviet era was not only a political and economic experiment, it was also a cultural revolution. From 1917 to 1991, the state sought to reshape Russian identity through ideology, art, and education. Literature was censored, but great works still emerged. Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, banned for decades, became a symbol of artistic resistance. Propaganda posters and films glorified the worker and the collective, creating a visual language that still resonates today. The Soviet space program, celebrated through grand parades and patriotic songs, inspired a generation to dream beyond Earth. Yet this period also left scars. Countless voices were silenced, and creative freedom was crushed beneath state control. After the collapse of the USSR, Russia struggled to reconcile its imperial past, Soviet legacy, and modern identity. The result is a culture both nostalgic and forward-looking, forever carrying the weight of history while seeking its place in the world festivals of fire and faith. Russia's calendar is alive with festivals that weave together ancient pagan customs, Orthodox rituals, and Soviet-era traditions. Maslenitsa, the butter festival, marks the end of winter with blazing bonfires, dancing, and the joyful eating of blini thin pancakes, symbolizing the returning sun. In contrast, Easter in the Russian Orthodox Church is a solemn yet luminous celebration, where cathedrals glow with candlelight and believers greet one another with the phrase, "Christ is risen." On Victory Day, May 9th, the air fills with pride and grief as Russians honor the 27 million lives lost during the Great Patriotic War. Watching military parades march through Red Square beneath the shadows of history. Even Soviet-era traditions persist. New Year's Eve remains the most beloved holiday, a night of toasts, fireworks, and family gatherings where Ded Moroz, the Slavic Father Frost, delivers gifts to children. Through these festivals, Russians express both resilience and reverence, celebrating survival, faith, and collective memory. Rodina, love for the motherland. Few concepts capture the Russian soul better than Rodina, the deep, almost spiritual love for the motherland. Rodina is more than geography. It is the forests where ancestors hunted, the rivers that sustained villages, the frozen steppes that swallowed invaders. This connection to the land is woven into poetry, song, and even politics. For centuries, Russians have endured wars, famines, and revolutions. Yet the idea of Rodina has been a constant anchor, inspiring sacrifice and unity. During World War II, soldiers often carried soil from their hometowns into battle, believing it would give them strength. To leave Russia, even voluntarily, can feel like tearing away a piece of oneself. This bond explains why Russian art, literature, and music so often express nostalgia, longing, and melancholy. To understand Rodina is to understand why, for Russians, history is not just remembered, it is lived, generation after generation, a land that shapes its people. Russia's culture cannot be separated from its geography, a vast one-day land that has forged its people's character, traditions, and resilience. Winters here are legendary, -40 degrees Celsius in Siberia. Snowstorms swallowing entire landscapes, rivers freezing so solid that armies have marched across them. In these conditions, survival demanded resourcefulness and unity, shaping a culture where community often outweighs individualism. The vast taiga forests inspired folklore filled with mystical creatures, while the endless steppes taught patience and endurance. Russia's remoteness has also fostered a sense of isolation, fueling both its independence and its distrust of outsiders. From the bustling streets of Moscow to the lonely fishing villages on the Kamchatka Peninsula, Russia's size and diversity create a mosaic of traditions, each region carrying its own songs, dances, dialects, and legends. To know Russia is to understand that its land is not just a backdrop, it is a living force that shapes destiny, modern arts, and pop culture. Despite its reverence for tradition, Russia's modern cultural scene is vibrant, experimental, and global. Russian cinema has found a new voice with directors like Andrei Zhuzhentsov, whose haunting films like Leviathan explore morality and power in a changing society. Contemporary writers like Lyudmila Yulitskaya and Viktor Pelevin push literature into bold, surreal territories, blending history with modern existentialism. In music, Russia bridges heritage and innovation. Classical orchestras still captivate audiences, while pop stars like Alla Pugacheva and rock icons like Boris Grebenshchikov shaped generations. Street art has flourished in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, while platforms like YouTube and VK have given rise to independent musicians and creators. Yet, even in modern expression, there's an unmistakable Russian melancholy, a reflection of a culture deeply aware of its burdens, beauty, and contradictions. Tradition versus modernity. Today, Russia stands at a cultural crossroads. On one side lies centuries of tradition, Orthodox faith, classical literature, folklore, and the deep reverence for Rodina. On the other lies a rapidly modernizing society, connected to global trends, yet determined to preserve its identity. In urban centers, young Russians embrace Western fashion, digital art, and global cinema, while in rural villages, ancient customs from wedding rituals to harvest festivals remain largely untouched. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 unleashed a wave of cultural freedom, but also created an identity crisis. What does it mean to be Russian in a post-Soviet globalized world? This tension between past and present defines modern Russia's cultural heartbeat. It is a nation rooted in memory, yet restless for reinvention, carrying its history like a burden and a blessing. And through this struggle, Russian culture continues to evolve, endlessly complex, deeply human, and impossible to define with a single story. A land of boundless riches. Stretching across 11 time zones and covering 1/8 of the Earth's surface, Russia is a geological treasure chest. Beneath its vast steppes, icy tundras, and rugged mountains lie immense reserves of natural wealth: oil, natural gas, coal, iron, gold, diamonds, and precious rare earth minerals. Its forests, the lungs of the world, produce timber at unmatched scales, while its rivers, lakes, and fertile soils once fed entire empires. Yet, Russia's blessing has always been a paradox. Its resources promise unimaginable prosperity, but its harsh climate and remote geography make extraction a constant challenge. Siberia, for instance, holds some of the world's richest oil and gas fields. But temperatures plunge to -50 degrees Celsius, freezing machinery and cutting off access for months. Historically, this natural wealth attracted envy and invasion, from Napoleon's ambitions to Hitler's Operation Barbarossa. For centuries, Russia's economy has been defined by a battle between nature and necessity, between a land overflowing with riches and the relentless struggle to harness them. The Tsarist economy, feudal shadows. Before the industrial age, Russia's economy was rooted in agrarian feudalism. Under the Tsars, wealth flowed upward, concentrated among nobles and aristocrats, while millions of serfs worked the land in near-slavery conditions. By the 18th century, Russia had become one of Europe's largest exporters of grain, timber, and furs. Yet internally, vast sections of its population remained trapped in poverty and illiteracy. Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725, recognized that Russia lagged behind Western Europe and launched sweeping reforms, modernizing shipyards, founding new industries, and establishing St. Petersburg as a window to Europe. Yet, despite these efforts, the country's economy remained deeply unequal. Serfs were only freed in 1861 under Tsar Alexander II. But emancipation came with crushing debts and little land ownership. Russia's late industrialization left it vulnerable, and by the dawn of the 20th century, a growing urban working class began demanding radical change. The seeds of revolution were sown not just in ideology, but in economic despair. The Soviet command economy. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, they inherited a nation exhausted by war, famine, and inequality. Vladimir Lenin envisioned a planned economy where resources would be collectively owned and production centrally directed. The Soviet Union nationalized industries, banks, and agriculture, eliminating private ownership almost overnight. Under Joseph Stalin, this system intensified through 5-year plans. The USSR transformed from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse. Massive factories rose in Magnitogorsk, hydroelectric dams reshaped rivers and entire cities. were built around mines and steelworks. Yet, this rapid transformation came at a terrible human cost. Collectivization forced millions of peasants off their land, sparking famines like the Holodomor in Ukraine 1932-1933, where millions perished. While the Soviet model achieved extraordinary feats, launching the first satellite and producing nuclear weapons, it also created inefficiencies, shortages, and a culture of fear. The economy was powerful, but brittle, a machine driven by ideology rather than market forces, industrialization and agricultural reforms. Stalin's Industrial Revolution fundamentally reshaped Russia's economy. Gigantic steel plants, railways, and arms factories turned the Soviet Union into a superpower almost overnight. But agriculture, once Russia's lifeblood, suffered. Traditional farming methods were uprooted as collective farms or kolkhozes replaced centuries-old village systems. While urban centers experienced unprecedented growth, rural communities faced famine, forced labor, and repression. To maintain control, the state prioritized heavy industry and military production over consumer goods, leaving everyday life plagued by shortages of basics like clothing, food, and housing. Yet, the Soviet leadership believed these sacrifices were necessary to defend the motherland. And indeed, when Nazi Germany invaded in 1941, it was the industrial might of the Soviet economy relocated deep into the Ural Mountains and Siberia that produced the tanks, planes, and ammunition needed to repel the invaders. This economic mobilization saved the USSR, but entrenched a model that placed state power above individual prosperity, geography, and economic destiny. Russia's economic history cannot be separated from its geography. Its vast distances make infrastructure costly, while its northern latitude means much of its land is locked beneath permafrost or subject to extreme winters. Transporting goods across 9,000 kilometers of railway from Moscow to Vladivostok is a logistical feat few nations could manage. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in 1916, remains a symbol of Russia's determination to bind its territories together, and a reminder of the constant tension between ambition and environment. Geography has also shaped trade, lacking warm water ports for much of its history. Russia has long sought access to seas and straits, influencing conflicts from the Crimean War to modern disputes in the Black Sea. To this day, Russia's economy remains highly dependent on energy exports from Siberia, pipelines stretching like arteries toward Europe and Asia. In Russia, the land gives wealth, but it also demands sacrifice, a pattern that has defined its past and continues to dictate its future. The Cold War economic rivalry. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged, not just victorious, but transformed into one of the two global superpowers. Its cities lay in ruins, but its industrial might remained unmatched. The USSR launched into the Cold War, an era defined by ideological, military, and economic rivalry with the United States. Moscow poured resources into heavy industry, nuclear weapons, and space exploration. In 1957, the world gasped as the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, igniting the space race. By 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in orbit, cementing Soviet technological prestige. Yet, this glory came at an enormous cost. While trillions of rubles funded military expansion and scientific breakthroughs, consumer goods, clothing, electronics, even basic foodstuffs remained scarce. Stores often displayed empty shelves, and citizens queued for hours to buy bread or sugar. In the Soviet worldview, guns came before butter, and as the arms race intensified, the strain on the economy deepened. Behind the facade of power, cracks were forming, the weight of central planning. The Soviet economic model was built on central planning where production quotas were dictated by the state rather than market demand. On paper, this system promised equality and efficiency. In practice, it led to staggering waste and mismatched priorities. Factories were rewarded for quantity, not quality. A steel plant might boast record output, yet produce sheets too thick for practical use. Farmers were ordered to grow crops in unsuitable climates, leading to shortages and famines, even in fertile regions. Innovation suffered under bureaucratic rigidity. Engineers feared failure. Entrepreneurs didn't exist, and competition was seen as capitalist corruption. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union faced what economists called the era of stagnation, while the United States surged ahead with personal computing, consumer goods, and global trade. The USSR struggled to modernize its outdated industries. Oil and gas exports temporarily masked the decline. But beneath the surface, the Soviet economy was becoming a giant with feet of clay. The collapse of the Soviet economy. By the 1980s, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the USSR was drowning in debt, inefficiency, and declining productivity, facing mounting pressure. Gorbachev introduced perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost openness reforms meant to modernize the economy and loosen state control. But instead of stabilizing the system, these policies accelerated its unraveling. Enterprises given limited independence failed to compete globally, while reduced censorship exposed citizens to the West's consumer abundance, fueling discontent. Simultaneously, the USSR's military spending to match the U.S., particularly during the Reagan era, drained its finances. In 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. 15 republics broke away. Moscow's central authority crumbled, and an economy once designed to feed 293 million people dissolved almost overnight. Inflation soared to 2,500%, savings evaporated, and pensions became worthless. For ordinary Russians, the collapse meant not liberation, but economic chaos. The once mighty superpower was suddenly a beggar on the global stage. Shock therapy and the rise of oligarchs. In the 1990s, Russia embraced shock therapy, a radical attempt to transform a planned economy into a free market system virtually. Overnight, prices were liberalized, state-owned industries privatized, and foreign investors welcomed. But instead of prosperity, chaos reigned. Factories shut down, unemployment skyrocketed, and millions fell into poverty. While ordinary citizens struggled, a handful of well-connected insiders seized vast sectors of the economy: oil, gas, banking, and media, becoming the infamous Russian oligarchs. Figures like Boris Berezovsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and Roman Abramovich amassed billions while hospitals closed, wages went unpaid, and crime syndicates ruled the streets. The ruble collapsed in 1998, wiping out what little stability remained. Western advisors had promised a smooth transition, but for many Russians, capitalism arrived like a storm, dismantling the social safety nets they had known all their lives. For the first time since Peter the Great, the Russian people began questioning whether Western economic models could ever work on Russian soil. Seeds of a new era. Out of the chaos of the 1990s rose a new vision for Russia's economy, one rooted in resource power and state control. By the late decade, a little-known former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin began consolidating authority, vowing to restore stability, dignity, and sovereignty. He understood that Russia's greatest economic weapon lay beneath its frozen soil, oil, and natural gas. Under his leadership, the state regained control over key energy giants like Gazprom and Rosneft, turning energy exports into the backbone of national power. By the mid-2000s, soaring oil prices fueled a period of rapid growth, lifting millions out of poverty and transforming Moscow and St. Petersburg into glittering financial hubs. Yet, this recovery carried a hidden vulnerability. Russia became dangerously dependent on energy revenues, leaving it exposed to global price swings and sanctions. Still, for ordinary Russians, the Putin era symbolized a return to strength after years of humiliation, a promise that Russia would never again bow to the West. Putin's economic strategy. When Vladimir Putin assumed the presidency in 2000, Russia was battered, humiliated, and fragmented by the chaos of the 1990s. Putin's promise was simple, yet powerful: restore stability and greatness. His strategy hinged on three pillars: state control of key industries, energy dominance, and geopolitical leverage. The Kremlin reasserted authority over energy giants like Gazprom and Rosneft, transforming oil and natural gas into instruments of national power. At the same time, Russia imposed strict tax reforms, stabilized the ruble, and rebuilt investor confidence. By 2008, high oil prices fueled economic growth rates exceeding 7% annually. Foreign reserves soared past $600 billion, and living standards improved dramatically. Moscow's skyline filled with glass towers, shopping malls, and luxury boutiques, a visual symbol of Russia's return to power. Yet behind the glitter lay a fragile foundation, an economy dangerously dependent on energy exports, where nearly 50% of federal revenues came from oil and gas. In building Russia's resurgence, Putin had tied its fate to the price of a barrel: energy as a weapon. With control over the world's largest natural gas reserves and one of the biggest oil producers, Russia turned its energy dominance into a geopolitical weapon. Europe, in particular, became heavily dependent on Russian gas flowing through pipelines like Nord Stream and Druzhba. This dependence gave Moscow leverage in foreign policy. Energy supply became intertwined with political compliance. Countries challenging Russian influence often faced price hikes, reduced deliveries, or supply cutoffs. Meanwhile, Russia deepened energy partnerships with China, India, and the Middle East, seeking to diversify its markets and reduce exposure to Western pressure. But energy wealth also came with risks. As global oil prices plummeted in 2014, Russia's revenues collapsed, exposing its lack of diversification. The Kremlin's bet on hydrocarbons created boom-and-bust cycles that left the broader economy vulnerable. In trying to wield energy as a tool of power, Russia had also become hostage to it: sanctions and economic isolation. In 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea triggered a wave of Western sanctions targeting banks, energy firms, and key individuals close to the Kremlin. Access to foreign credit was cut off. Advanced technologies for Arctic oil exploration were restricted, and the ruble plunged to historic lows. Inflation soared, foreign investors fled, and the economy slipped into recession. In response, Russia adopted an import substitution strategy, boosting domestic agriculture and manufacturing. Surprisingly, this crisis accelerated a quiet transformation. Russian farmers expanded grain production so successfully that by 2018, Russia became the world's largest wheat exporter. However, sanctions also pushed Moscow into a closer embrace with China, accelerating energy deals like the Power of Siberia pipeline and deepening Russia's role within the BRICS alliance. Yet, while sanctions failed to cripple Russia entirely, they isolated it financially, limited technological progress, and cemented its dependence on resource exports and non-Western markets. The 2008 crisis and beyond. Before Crimea, Russia had already faced a warning shot during the 2008 global financial crisis. Collapsing oil prices, dwindling foreign investment, and a stock market crash erased years of economic gains. Although Moscow used its foreign reserves to stabilize banks and industries, growth slowed dramatically. By the early 2010s, the Russian economy was stagnating. Productivity lagged, infrastructure aged, and innovation struggled. The post-Crimea sanctions compounded these problems, restricting access to cutting-edge technologies essential for sectors like energy, aerospace, and defense. Meanwhile, capital flight accelerated, with wealthy elites moving billions abroad amid fears of tighter state control. For ordinary Russians, this meant rising prices, lower wages, and declining living standards, even as the Kremlin projected strength on the global stage. Russia's economic resilience became a balancing act, adapting to crises while avoiding structural reforms that could weaken state control. A fragile fortress. By the late 2010s, Russia portrayed itself as an economic fortress immune to Western pressure. It slashed foreign debt, built a rainy day fund exceeding $600 billion, and pursued trade in currencies other than the US dollar. Yet, beneath this image of strength lay persistent vulnerabilities. Dependence on oil and gas revenues remained high. Demographic decline strained the workforce, and chronic underinvestment in education and technology slowed innovation. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 exposed further weaknesses, sending oil prices crashing and forcing emergency spending. As tensions with the West escalated, Russia doubled down on forging alliances with China, India, and the Global South, positioning itself as a counterweight to US-led globalization. But the reality remains. Russia's economic power is both formidable and fragile, a nation rich in resources yet vulnerable to external shocks, thriving on strength but haunted by dependency. Current situation? The return of the bear. The Putin-era power consolidated. At the dawn of the 21st century, Russia was a nation in search of itself, scarred by the chaos of the 1990s, humiliated on the world stage, and yearning for a leader who could restore its pride. Vladimir Putin rose from obscurity, a former KGB officer with a quiet demeanor but a steely resolve. And within a few years, he reshaped Russia's political landscape. He centralized power in the Kremlin, weakened opposition forces, and reasserted state control over the country's most strategic sectors. To many Russians, he brought order out of chaos. Crime rates fell, wages rose, and Moscow glittered with kriss. And leaves a rich, long-lasting color. And reasserted state. My lock stays, control all with court. And we see with kriz, my mizistov. We see with krelis, we sell with us, myself. We see with sellas, sit with sellas. We see with craze of legad. Go with we karita we see, to see it, by we see to see with isa kedent. I see ki we se besika eyes aga with those isa secret to set to lives. Sickness to get it to casa the keys is a good it's to the daliglisik but the to the to we did this good to signs of prosperity. But this stability came at a price. A gradual erosion of democratic freedoms, tighter media control, and the silencing of political dissent. By the late 2010s, Putin had become more than a president. He was a symbol, embodying the idea of Russia's resurgence. To his supporters, he restored dignity. To his critics, he built an authoritarian fortress cloaked in nationalism. The Ukraine conflict, a new Cold War. In 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea sent shockwaves across the globe. For Putin, it was framed as a historic correction, reclaiming territory he viewed as inherently Russian. For the West, it was an act of aggression that shattered decades of post-Cold War stability. Tensions escalated, NATO expanded its presence in Eastern Europe, and Western nations unleashed sanctions aimed at crippling Moscow's economy. But the conflict reached a boiling point in February 2022, when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Suddenly, the world was thrust into a new era of geopolitical confrontation. The images were haunting. Tanks rolling across borders. Cities reduced to rubble, millions fleeing their homes. For Russia, the war was portrayed as a fight against Western encroachment. For Ukraine, it was a battle for sovereignty and survival. And for the world, it marked the return of great power rivalry, reshaping the global order in ways unseen since. The Cold War, the Sanctions War. The 2022 invasion triggered the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. The West froze over $300 billion of Russia's foreign reserves, banned technology exports, restricted banking transactions, and targeted hundreds of oligarchs and officials. Major corporations from McDonald's to Apple exited the Russian market overnight, leaving malls deserted and supply chains fractured. Yet, in defiance of expectations, Russia's economy did not collapse. Instead, Moscow rerouted trade to China, India, Turkey, and the Middle East, selling oil and gas at discounted rates and doubling down on domestic production. The ruble, initially in freefall, stabilized as the Kremlin imposed strict capital controls. But beneath the surface, the pressure is immense. Industries dependent on Western technologies face slow decline. Inflation eats away at savings, and the exodus of skilled professionals, particularly in IT and engineering, threatens long-term growth. The sanctions war has become a battle of endurance, testing whether Russia or the West will blink first. A multipolar world emerging. As relations with the West fractured, Russia turned decisively toward the global South and Asia. Ties with China deepened, marked by billion-dollar energy deals and coordinated positions on global forums. India emerged as a crucial buyer of discounted Russian oil, while nations in Africa and the Middle East welcomed Moscow's willingness to challenge Western dominance. Within the BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Russia positioned itself as part of a rising multipolar world, rejecting the US-led economic and political order. Yet, this pivot is not without risks. Growing reliance on China makes Russia vulnerable to Beijing's economic leverage, while trade diversification struggles to replace lost European markets. Still, for Moscow, forging new alliances is central to its vision of resisting Western isolation and asserting itself as an independent global power. A return to superpower ambition under a new banner: isolation and influence. Today, Russia finds itself caught between isolation and influence. On one hand, its war in Ukraine and confrontation with NATO have alienated it from much of the West, pushing it toward political, economic, and technological seclusion. On the other hand, Moscow wields enormous leverage over energy supplies, food security, and global diplomacy, ensuring it cannot be ignored. Its vast reserves of oil, gas, grain, and rare earth minerals make it an indispensable player in many regions. But internally, challenges mount: demographic decline, shrinking foreign investment, and growing unrest among younger generations who seek a more open, connected future. For Putin, maintaining control requires balancing national pride with economic reality, security needs with global aspirations. As the world shifts toward multipolarity, Russia stands at a crossroads, determined to redefine its place in history, yet haunted by the weight of its past and the uncertainty of its future. The cost of survival. In Moscow's glittering avenues, luxury cars glide past designer boutiques, and skyscrapers pierce the horizon. Yet travel just a few kilometers beyond the city center, and a different Russia emerges, one where aging Soviet-era apartment blocks crumble, villages are abandoned, and families struggle to survive. For millions, sanctions have meant rising food prices, disappearing Western products, and shrinking job opportunities. Ordinary Russians are adapting in quiet ways, brewing homemade detergents, repairing old electronics, and growing vegetables in backyard gardens, a survival instinct rooted deep in the nation's history. But beneath this resilience lies fatigue. A young nurse in Tver whispers, "I used to dream of Paris. Now, I just dream of buying medicine for my father." Story mirrors millions. For the elite, Russia's pivot east brings new business opportunities. For the working class, it brings uncertainty, a widening gulf between Moscow's wealth and the rest of Russia's struggles. The digital Iron Curtain. In a world driven by information, Russia has built walls instead of windows. Since the invasion of Ukraine, hundreds of independent news outlets have been shut down, foreign platforms banned, and social media heavily restricted. The state controls most television channels, shaping narratives to unify public opinion and suppress dissent. But the digital generation refuses to be silenced. Using VPNs, encrypted apps, and underground forums, young Russians bypass government firewalls to access global news and alternative viewpoints. This clash between narratives has divided society. Older generations consume state-driven patriotism, while younger Russians increasingly seek unfiltered truths. One 22-year-old programmer from St. Petersburg confides, "I live in two Russias, one on TV and one online." The Kremlin's tightening grip aims to preserve national unity, but every new restriction deepens the rift between tradition and modernity. The military machine and its toll. For 2 decades, Putin poured billions into modernizing Russia's armed forces, transforming them into one of the world's most formidable military machines. Hypersonic missiles, advanced drones, and cyber warfare capabilities were showcased as symbols of national strength. But the Ukraine war has tested these ambitions like never before. Behind the glossy propaganda, cracks have emerged, depleted ammunition, strained logistics, and mounting casualties. Thousands of Russian families have received the dreaded black notices, informing them that a son, brother, or father has been lost at the front. In rural regions, entire communities are missing young men, a silent wound that rarely makes headlines. While state TV praises sacrifice for the motherland, quiet grief spreads across kitchens and living rooms. A grandmother in Rostov clutches her grandson's photograph and whispers, "He died a hero, but I would trade every medal just to hear his voice again." The generational divide. Inside Russia, a battle for the nation's soul is unfolding, not on the front lines, but between generations. Older Russians, shaped by the hardships of the Soviet collapse and NATO's expansion, often view Putin as a protector who restored dignity after years of humiliation. But for the millennial and Gen Z population, the world is different. They grew up online, exposed to Western culture, global trends, and alternative ideas. For them, isolation feels suffocating, nationalism outdated. Many dream of traveling, studying abroad, and building startups, aspirations increasingly blocked by sanctions and visa bans. Some choose silence, others choose exile. Since 2022, hundreds of thousands of young professionals have fled to Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Europe, carrying with them a sense of disillusionment. Those who remain live in a paradox. They love their country but fear its future. This widening generational rift could shape Russia's destiny more than any geopolitical strategy, a nation redefining itself. Beneath the surface of hardship and control, Russia is experiencing something profound, a redefinition of identity. The Ukraine war has forced society to confront painful questions. Who are we? What is our place in the world? For some, Russia is a besieged fortress, defending traditional values against a hostile West. For others, it's a nation trapped by its past, unable to fully embrace the modern global community. Artists, filmmakers, and writers, once celebrated worldwide, now face censorship at home and bans abroad. And yet, creativity thrives underground. Independent music festivals move secretly from city to city. Banned literature circulates in PDF form, and new voices emerge from the shadows, quietly imagining a different Russia. History has shown that this country can endure revolutions, invasions, and collapses, But the question now is whether it can reinvent itself without losing its soul. The energy chessboard. In the game of global power, Russia's resources are its strongest weapon. Beneath its vast Siberian wilderness lie oceans of oil, rivers of natural gas, and reserves of rare minerals critical to modern technology. For decades, pipelines from Russia fueled Europe's homes, factories, and economies. But after the invasion of Ukraine, the West severed its dependency, triggering an energy earthquake. Moscow responded by rerouting its oil and gas flows eastward, toward China, India, and Southeast Asia, while Europe scrambled to secure new suppliers. Prices soared, markets trembled, and winter brought energy insecurity to millions. Yet, even as Western nations sought to decouple, Russia found ways to exploit its role as a resource superpower. Grain exports fed Africa and the Middle East. Nuclear fuel-powered reactors from Hungary to Egypt and discounted oil kept developing economies afloat. Energy became more than commerce. It became diplomacy, a lifeline Russia wields to reshape global alliances in its favor. The China-Russia axis. If the Cold War divided the world into two camps, the 21st century is birthing something more complex, a strategic entanglement between Russia and China. Bound by mutual resentment of U.S. dominance, Moscow and Beijing forged historic energy. Deals expanded military cooperation and coordinated their stances at the UN Security Council. For Russia, China represents a colossal market and a shield against Western isolation. For China, Russia offers resources, a vast northern frontier, and a partner in challenging U.S. hegemony. Yet beneath the smiles and handshakes lies quiet tension. Beijing views Moscow as a junior partner, while Russia fears overdependence on China's economic gravity. Still, together, they represent a formidable counterweight to Western influence, one that is redefining the balance of power. Across Eurasia, this isn't a simple alliance. It's a marriage of necessity, one that could either reshape the 21st century or fracture under its own ambitions. A new Cold War. Across the Atlantic, policymakers whisper what many now openly admit. We are living through a new Cold War. NATO has expanded its footprint across Eastern Europe. U.S. military budgets have surged, and global supply chains are being rewritten along ideological lines. From the Baltic Sea to the South China Sea, proxy battles are intensifying, not with nuclear standoffs, but through cyber warfare, economic sanctions, and influence campaigns. In Africa, Russia's Wagner mercenaries secure mines and political influence. In the Middle East, Moscow brokers fragile deals in Syria while challenging U.S. oil dominance. And in the digital battlefield, Russian hackers wage silent wars, disrupting infrastructure, elections, and economies. Yet, unlike the Cold War of the past, today's conflict is messier, multipolar, and unpredictable. The old world of two superpowers is gone. What rises in its place is a fractured arena, where alliances shift like sand and every move carries global consequences. The weight of history, from the frozen fields of Borodino, where Napoleon's armies were crushed, to the charred ruins of Stalingrad, where Hitler's ambitions died. Russia's identity has always been forged in fire. Its history is one of endurance against impossible odds. Invasions survived, revolutions endured, empires risen and fallen. Yet today, the nation faces a battle more elusive than any foreign army: the struggle to define itself. Is Russia the heir of the Tsars, proud and imperial? Is it the ghost of the Soviet Union, yearning to reclaim lost glory? Or is it something new entirely, still waiting to be born from the chaos of the present? For every tank crossing a border, and every diplomat seated at a negotiation table, these questions echo beneath the Kremlin's walls. The past is not gone here. It is alive, shaping every decision, haunting every ambition. To understand Russia's future, one must listen to the ghosts of its history. The final narration. In the end, Russia is not just a country, it is a civilization, a continent of contradictions torn between East and West, tradition and progress, memory and destiny. From the gilded halls of the Tsars to the red banners of the Soviets, from the frozen Cold War standoff to the fiery battlefields of today, Russia has never merely followed history. It has shaped it. And yet, as the 21st century unfolds, its future remains unwritten. Will it rise again as a global superpower, or will it fracture under the weight of isolation and war? The world watches, because when Russia moves, history trembles. This was Historic Horizon TV. If you wish to uncover the untold stories of our past and understand the forces shaping our present, make sure to subscribe because history isn't over. It's happening right now.